you get to a point where you're like, all right, I just spent like 12 hours staring at my computer screen, pulling and analyzing and visualizing this data. My eyes hurt. Like, I just want to get it over to this person because they asked for this data. They didn't ask me for my opinion, right? But giving those insights, that last 1% of work, like that is also, I think, what gets people noticed and like what gets people promoted and what conveys to people that, oh, this is a good communicator. This is a good storyteller.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Data Scientist Show. Today, we have Felicia Rutberg. She is a growth strategy and analytics manager at Snap. Previously, she was a product data scientist at Spotify. She started her career as a management consultant at Accenture and later transitioned into data science. She studied mathematics at University of Vanderbilt. Felicia first reached out to me on LinkedIn because she wanted to share how she became a data scientist while diagnosed with ADHD. Today, we'll talk about product analytics at Spotify and Snap, her career journey, how she manages ADHD, and if we have some time later, maybe we'll talk about her side hustle as a matchmaker at Talkify. Welcome to the show, Felicia.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
Very excited to talk to you today. So how did you get into data science?
Yeah, so I think my journey into data science might be somewhat similar to other people that graduated around the same time as I did. So I graduated college, Vanderbilt University in 2016, and I studied math and cognitive psychology. And at that point, I didn't know the term data science, right? I think now it's a lot more of a popular term, and there's like so many programs and schools with, that offer it as a major or minor. But at that point, I didn't know about it. I knew that I liked statistics, and I knew that I really enjoyed psychology and like learning about people. But I thought it was cool from like a mathematical perspective as well. I think also like being a child of immigrants, like more technical fields are kind of encouraged.
Yeah.
It was hard to sell psychology, but I had kind of told my parents, okay, maybe I'll try like being an actuary, if you know what that is.
Yeah.
And my junior year summer, I was doing an internship at an insurance company, New York Life Insurance, and I was actually like I was just in like a corporate function. It was super like hard to for me to get that internship. Like I felt really grateful, but I wanted to network my way into actuary. And like the actuary kids were like the cool club because it was like an insurance company, But I had met someone from Accenture that actually was a Vanderbilt alum. He and his team were doing a project at New York Life, and he was like, "You should try management consulting." And again, as like a child of immigrants, you don't know about a lot of these terms, like management consulting, right? So like accounting and actuary, but management consulting. So I was like, okay, I don't know what that is, and I'm like already going into my senior year. But he was like, no, listen, I think that you could be good at it. I think you would enjoy it. He was like, apply and I'll help you. I'll help you like at least get an interview, right? So because as a math major, my GPA wasn't as high as maybe like other people that were applying to consulting. So I ended up going through the interviews and getting the job and then starting at Accenture. And I'm happy to talk more about it if you're interested. But about like, I think, my role was like analytical, but a lot more from like an Excel standpoint, like a little bit of like Tableau. But around like 2017, 2018, like 1-2 years into working, I started hearing this term data science come up. And Accenture was doing a lot of like AI and blockchain and just like technology work. So I looked into it and I was like, oh, this seems like a perfect blend of both like math and psychology. So I should explore that a little more. So I did a data science project as actually my last project at Accenture before I moved to Spotify. But as I was doing that project, I was like, this seems really cool. However, I don't have like SQL or Python skills, and I'm not going to learn it after work. I know myself. I'm just not going to do it. So I was like, I want to be a data scientist. I think I could do it. I'm like not doing it though. So my thought process was, I should go to a company that I really want to be at that has a strong data science practice and like a strong like democratization of data where you could like learn SQL and stuff on the side with the data. Because for example, when you work in consulting, the only data that you get is specific to the client, and it's often like Excel sheets, right? So the sort of like ceiling or like the resistance to learning data science on the job at Accenture would have been a lot higher for me, because I would have to like create my own SQL databases and like all of that, versus I kind of had this hypothesis that if I were to go to a company like Spotify that has a lot of democratization of their data, like you can just access it through BigQuery, like I would just be able to learn with the data that already exists, as opposed to like taking a course outside of work. So I ended up finding a role on LinkedIn that was like senior financial analyst that really required like some Excel and analytical skills. Like they required SQL, but they didn't give me a SQL screen, right? So they asked me what an inner join was. So I ended up, that was like kind of my hypothesis. Like if I got this kind of job, I can learn on the job, and then I can transition more full time into data science, and that's what I did. And you know, I feel like when people reach out to me and kind of like what I know a lot of people have this advice, so it's nothing new, but a lot of people reach out to me about how to get their first like data science job. I think an adjacent job in the company that you want to be in that has a strong data science practice is really, really helpful, because when you're in a data-driven company and one where data isn't super like privatized and like anyone can access it, you just get opportunities to use data when you're not in a data role. So like I was on the finance team, and it's not even that I got opportunities, it's that nobody else wanted to like write SQL code, right? Like they were in finance, like they didn't want to do it. So it was just like, oh, Felicia can do it. So I just like I learned SQL extremely quickly on the job there as a senior financial analyst and Tableau, and then kind of tried to learn at least enough Python where I could like pass an interview, and then I internally had to interview and got a data scientist job at Spotify.
Yeah, thanks for sharing your journey. And I think it's really smart that you leverage what you already know and what you're good at to get into a company where there's a data scientist role and you learn on the job and then you transition. I think a lot of people find it difficult to transition because they feel like they're going into something completely different. But we always have the domain knowledge we already know in the current industry, so you can actually use it as your advantage, so you can have a smoother transition. And I think you have very good awareness of yourself. You know, okay, I'm not gonna learn after work. So you have the strategy based on your learning style, your personality, and then you create a path for yourself and interview internally. I understand you still need to study for the interview, like how I transitioned within like Amazon, but you already have the trust of your current team and the manager. They can see your previous performance, so they already have the trust in you.
Yeah. And I mean, I will say that, for example, like had I failed the data science technical screen, like even if I had trust from managers, it wouldn't have worked, unfortunately, because you just like need to pass the screen. But like you said, like having some domain knowledge like can help with some of these data science interviews, because like even if they're SQL or Python, like when you're familiar with the data, it's just like more comfortable to like you're just more comfortable. You're not like, what is this word? What kind of metrics am I supposed to be looking for? Right. Like, especially Spotify, you have a presentation as your final round. And like, again, even though I'm sure a lot of people had like more sophisticated models, it was like, at least I knew that the data that I was analyzing, like I knew what metrics were important to the team that I was like applying for example, which could help. I think it's definitely also what I think is the most helpful about transitioning internally is not even necessarily your leverage like in in the screen, but it's to actually get your resume looked at. Like that's the biggest thing, because like I was referring a lot of my friends from Accenture that had very similar experience to me to data science roles at Spotify, and they weren't getting interviews. And when I asked some of the recruiters, they were like, we want to interview people that already have like data science experience at tech companies, right? Which is why I think another piece of advice that I often hear that I think is good is like, if you can't make it into like an Amazon or a Spotify or a Google, like try a startup and then move around. But I think that was like the most helpful thing about like getting my foot in the door, was just like I was already at the company, so I could like Slack someone and be like, hey, like I Slack the recruiter directly and be like, I'm interested in applying to this role. And like they have to give you an interview if you're internal. Right?
Yeah. That's a very good advice.
Yeah. And sorry, just one last thing I want to say is that like, I think that, so like you mentioned, some people feel like it's difficult to transition internally. And I do think that it could be, but I think that being again at a company like a Spotify or an Amazon, or just any company that has like AWS or like Google BigQuery, like where data is like really readily available, like any role that you have, like project manager, product manager, like financial analyst, like you have to use data. And oftentimes people in those roles will come to data scientists or data engineers, but can you pull this for me? So it's like, if you're in that role, you have that opportunity to pull that data yourself. So there's just like, there's really ample opportunity to like force yourself to learn on the job.
Yeah. If you can directly get into data science, first get into data. So when you have access to those data, there's always a million things usually the team want to solve, but in the backlog. And maybe you can pick up a few, hey, I just want to try it out. And you can maybe try something like simple regression, or maybe just creating some visualization, and you're building your portfolio. When you finish the project, you can put it on your resume, and that will be something later on recruiters can look at. Oh, this person actually worked on some data science project.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So can you tell us what was your day-to-day at Spotify? What did you do?
Sure. So it varied because like I mentioned, I had two roles at Spotify. I had that senior financial analyst role for a year and a half, and then I had a data scientist role for a year and a half. As a senior financial analyst, my first role, it was a lot of SQL and a lot of Tableau. It was honestly much closer to what I would anticipate like a business intelligence role is like. And I think because at that point, Spotify had just gone public about like 1 to 2 years ago. And so there was a pretty big finance team, but there was a lot of like Excel, Google Sheets based processes that I think we wanted to get out of those kind of tools and like put into BigQuery and put into Tableau and kind of create dashboards so I was on the sales team. I was on the ad sales finance team at first. So like we wanted to create these dashboards for the sales team. We wanted to create dashboards for like our CFO and for our leadership to like really understand the financials in just a much more easily digestible way than like a giant like Excel or Google Sheets like file. So that was really what a lot of the job entailed. And at that point, I was good with that because again, I wanted to learn those skills, and it was like a really fast way to learn those skills. My manager was very ambitious and had like really high expectations for the team. So we produced a lot of dashboards and a lot of like data sets and a lot of more basic type of like forecasting models. Again, not like what data scientists think of as forecasting, but more of what like financial analysts think of as forecasting, or really tried to like automate that. Like some things I really found interesting, for example, was like when from the data side, we were working on like podcasts because like Spotify had just become like a pretty major player in the podcast space at the time. And we had like acquired Gimlet and Anchor. And so we were trying to integrate data from a bunch of like disparate companies and sources into one area and make sense of it, to understand like how are we doing from like an ads inventory perspective for podcasts. So I thought that was pretty interesting. And, you know, at that time, I feel like I didn't really appreciate the context that I was learning in. I was just really trying to focus on, okay, I really know SQL, I really know Tableau, as opposed to like the context. I was like, oh, I don't care about ads. But I almost, like, thinking about it now, I'm like, oh, it was actually cool that I was learning a CPM is, or like a sell through rate, or some of this stuff that's, like you said before, domain knowledge. I feel like and this is actually kind of a regret that I have at for a bunch of my projects at Accenture too, is like, I wish that I had focused a little bit more on like the domain and really allowed myself to get interested, even if it doesn't seem like the most interesting. Like, insurance or ads is not interesting to everyone. I wish I'd focused a little bit more on that industry piece, because I think, and I'm sure that we'll get into this, like, some people, at least me, myself, something I started realizing within data science was that I really enjoy talking to people and building relationships. And if you only focus on the technical, like, you will not get those opportunities.
Yeah.
Even if you're the technical. So that was what my day-to-day looked like in my first year and a half. Towards the end of that tenure, though, we started thinking about, and this ended up happening right after I left, but building out a business intelligence team in finance. And so I was kind of going to be the first founding member, and then I ended up switching to a data science role. And happy at any point if you want to delve more into why I did that. But
yeah, so sorry, before we talk more about your day-to-day at a product data center role, I'm curious if you could share example. You mentioned when you socialize, talk to people, sometimes you will get unexpected project that can be very interesting. Do you have an example or a story to share?
Oh yeah, I mean, definitely that what you're talking about happened a lot more in the second half of my time at Spotify. And I think part of it is also leadership. Like, you need to have managers that are supportive of what you want to do. My second manager at Spotify was probably like the best manager in the world. He actually comes from Amazon, but he is just like the most amazing manager that you could imagine, like extremely supportive. Not to say that my first manager was not supportive. I think to your point, like I think with my first manager, I had told him that I was interested in more like data science work. So he recommended, like, why don't you develop a forecasting model for like ads inventory, and understanding our supply and demand. And like, I remember I spun up like a notebook and Jupyter, and I was like excited to do that. I think though it came at a time where I felt like I wanted to transition to a different team. So I didn't get to like fully finish with that project, but I was very vocal from like the beginning about the work that I wanted to do, which I think is really important. And I think that maybe my second half at Spotify illustrates that in a more like structured and positive way, because I think I didn't know as much in my first year and a half what I wanted. I think I just wanted a data scientist title, which I know is a common like pitfall people tend to get into, and that can create some friction within your team, especially if you're not there for a year. So like, you have to be just strategic about everything. Like, you can't come in immediately and like tell your manager, hey, I know that you hired me for this role, but I don't want to be here and I want to be a data scientist, right?
Yeah.
So you have to be strategic in the way that you go about things. But sorry, I'm going on a long-winded tangent, but just like to your question, in my first year and a half, in terms of like working on more interesting projects, like definitely after maybe like 7 months on the job, I just started voicing more and more that I wanted like data science stuff. And my manager did try to find opportunities for me to, like I said, build like a model that predicted stuff on the ads front, which, is a very data science type of job. The difficulty though comes, especially if you're on like a very high performing like team, is you have a lot of responsibilities that need to get done, right? And so I was finding myself very burnt out, and too burnt out to like learn how to forecast. Yeah. So my thought process was, after about a year and a half, was kind of similar to what got me Spotify in the first place, which is I do not feel like I will have the energy to learn this after work.
Yeah.
I need to learn this next stuff on the job, and it needs to be a core part of the job.
Yeah. So that's when you started the kind of official transition, preparing for the interviews internally.
Yeah. So what actually happened was, and I think I was starting to say that I was going to be the founding member of the business intelligence team within finance. That was like what we were going to lead to. And towards kind of the end of my tenure on the finance team, as I mentioned, I was at first directly on ads finance, but then I started like doing more stuff with like content finance and markets finance, and like doing almost more like centralized business intelligence type of work, like building dashboards for, again, like for our CFO, or for our senior leadership team, or for podcasts. Those were the three last things I built before I left. But I remember so vividly, this was like July 12th of 2020, because I had realized, I was like, I don't want to be in finance. I do want to be in data. Okay, I'll go into the business intelligence team. I feel like I'm good at that. I feel that people in finance really trust me, like you had said. They come to me for help with dashboarding and querying, and like we have personal relationships. I was like, I think I could actually really thrive on this team. So I kind of emotionally committed to that, as opposed to transitioning into data science, especially because I didn't feel prepared for like a data science screen. But like July 12th, July 13th, I had seen on LinkedIn that someone liked a post from my then who became my manager, and he was hiring for a really unique role. It was like data scientist on the economics team, and it was like a new team, and it seemed a little bit less traditional data science and a little bit more like statistics, econometrics. He even mentioned like about liking people from consulting, and it was in the music mission, or like in the creator mission. And one thing I was really missing being in finance is I felt like I could be in finance at any company. I didn't feel like I was getting the Spotify experience, because I didn't feel like the data I was analyzing was Spotify specific, right? Like the core product. Like I wasn't looking at like Drake streams, right? Which I thought, oh, that would be like super interesting, right? Like a big reason I applied to Spotify, other than a data democratization, was I was like, I love this company. I love music. So I saw that post, and I reached out to him on Slack. I found his name, and I was like, hey Kyle, like I'm really interested in this role. Like I'd love to just like learn a little bit more about it. It seems really unique. And so we got on a call July 13th, 2020, and I really liked his energy, and I really liked his vision for the team. And that was when I decided, okay, I have to interview for this. And that's when I like reached out to the recruiter and had to set up a technical screen.
I think it's great that you first reach out to the manager, have that initial chat, so he knows about you. Once the recruiter sourced your resume to him. Can I share a little bit about like internal transition in Amazon? Yeah, so there's the official process where you can apply, but some people don't know when you apply at the internal tool, your current manager will get a notification. So if you didn't have that conversation with new hiring manager and your current manager, it will be very awkward. So most people do what you did, reach out to the hiring manager, have an unofficial chat. Just get to know each other to see whether you have the shared passion in a role, shared vision, like you mentioned, or just on a personal level, do you feel the connection, right? Because when you want to transition to a different team, it's not just, oh, I just want to get a job, whatever it is. You actually want to find a team where you will enjoy doing the work. So you have this process, and then you go through some interviews. Sometimes they ask you to do the official application process, or sometimes they will have still an unofficial round. When you have more confidence or certainty in this team, you can have the conversation with your current manager, and then you apply. So I think in the process, those communication are very important.
No, definitely. And it is like it is tricky, right? Like you have to manage it delicately.
Yeah.
And it's exactly like it. I mean, I can't say it wasn't awkward. Like it was,
Yeah.
at a certain point, especially because I think my first manager at Spotify, he like kind of knew that I wanted to
Mhm.
go. And then this like promise of the business intelligence team, like I was like, okay, I'll stay. But you're right. Like, when you put in an official application, right? I'm like, I think of most companies, the manager gets
Right.
notified, and so I think like you said, like having that conversation just to see like, is this even a role that I'm interested in? Like, is it worth transitioning? Because like you have to also think about like, okay, I'm gonna restart, right? Like I'm gonna start from scratch versus I'm on a team maybe that already trusts me. Like, is it worth it? So yeah, just completely to your point. Like I just think in general, if you can like just have conversations with people before anything. And I know it's tough because people are really busy, but yeah, if people are willing to, like I was very grateful that he was willing to just like talk to me about it.
Hmm. Yeah, thanks for sharing the story. So, after you transition past the interview, can you tell us more about your what you're working on in the econometrics team?
Yeah, for sure, for sure. So, what I started, so because that team was new and the my manager had only been hired like a few months before I joined, he had an amazing vision. He's like a PhD economist. Again, he was like an Amazon for 6 years. He had like a really fantastic vision, but we didn't have yet like the data sets that we needed. So my first like couple of months on the team was like building these data sets that really helped us understand like artists' economics. So I leveraged a lot of data sets that were already built by different engineers across different teams. And it's funny when you get into like tech companies where you realize like there's 100 different like data sets that have the same information
Hmm.
with all slightly different logic and are like all slightly off by like 0.001% or something like that. It's just interesting. So, we wanted to build data sets that were really accurate and would help us really understand like the economic landscape to really start as like a foundational point for like our CEO's mission of like enabling 1 million creators to live off of their art. But it's like you can't enable 1 million creators to live off their art if you have no idea how many creators are actually living off their art, right? So it was like the first step was really developing these data sets and developing dashboards in Tableau that really captured the correct KPIs and like what we need to track. So that was like the first couple months. And because I joined, it was I think October 19th, 2020, we were like creating a plan for the following year. So it was like some forecasting work. Again, not like data science forecasting work, but just like rough forecasts that people in like finance and business do to understand like what we think the business will look
Hmm.
like next year and in the next couple of years. And what was really nice there was because I had already had experience with Google BigQuery and just all of our data sets. How do you request access? Like I could hit the ground running
Yeah.
immediately, which was really nice and something that now having started a new job, you realize is not the case. Cause like when you've been at a company for a while, you know what Slack channels to go to if you can't find like a data set or like how do you get access to data
Yeah.
immediately. We had like an internal GitHub and I was like, okay, I know what keywords to search, like to pull up certain people's like projects if I need to understand something. So that was really nice. And that was the first like three months of the role. And then we launched an external microsite called Loud and Clear, which anyone can look at if they want to, where we kind of shared this, and obviously not to the granular level that we have it at Spotify, but we shared more high level statistics with like the public with sort of the intention of transparency and commitment to artists' health. So I really appreciated that. I really liked working on that project because it was really cross
Yeah.
functional. I got to work really closely with like PR and communications to craft the narrative, right? Because like you have a bunch of data, but like what data do you want to show? And something like a pitfall that I definitely fell into, and something that I keep finding myself falling into, which I like definitely would recommend for people to work on if you're in the analytics space or really any space, is like I would not at first feel comfortable giving my own ideas. So for example, we were like creating personas, right? And the PR and communications team were like, okay, we want to see artists who are considered breakthrough artists, right? And they were like, okay, maybe breakthrough artists should be like people with less than 1 million streams like before 2020 and more than 1 million streams after 2020, right? So it's like crafting these narratives. And like, I was like, okay, sure, I'll provide the data. But I think I should have done a better job at being part of that creative process. And when we did that again the following year, I definitely was a lot more engaged, but and not even necessarily engaged, but more vocal on the idea front. But I think, again, going a little off tangent, but just like a little thing that I feel like I struggle with a little bit, or that people maybe in data can struggle with a bit, is like you learn, especially in your first couple years within the data world, to like take direction. And we all have a lot more than that. Like we can come up with the creative side too. And people do want to hear from you. So I think like that is definitely something that I realized on that project. Like, just because I'm not a PR communications expert doesn't mean that I don't have like a voice here as well in what we're crafting.
Yeah.
But
I think that's a great point. I think a lot of time data scientist feels like I'm kind of just like this funnel of data and I shouldn't have opinions. I think data scientists should have opinions, and what is important is to separate your opinions from facts. Hey, this is the data, this is the dashboard, and this is my opinion. I might be biased, but I'm the person who has been with this data for years or months. And I think your business stakeholder do want to know from your perspective, how do you interpret the results? And oftentimes we're wrong or they disagree with us, and it's okay. I think also it's important to let people know at work that you're someone who will speak up, who will disagree with people who has opinion.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a really, really good point. And I mean, I will also say that I think sometimes when you're tasked with pulling and analyzing a lot of data, right? Like it's easy to get burnt out. I don't know if anyone else feels this way, but like it's easy to get burnt out and just almost feel like I don't have the energy to also interpret this right now, And like people need things yesterday all the time. And you get to a point where you're like, I just spent like 12 hours staring at my computer screen, pulling and analyzing and like visualizing this data. My eyes hurt. I don't want to think anymore, right? So that's like common too. And I think, I'm sure this is like a common pain point data scientists find, is that like maybe they want to have that voice, they want to have more of that like strategic narrative, but there's just not like time for it because there's so many requests. There's not really time to like sit down and ponder. So teams that allow that is really, really amazing, and it's important like to self-advocate for that time.
I can relate to that, because when I was planning the project, I was so excited. Okay, after I pull this data, I will have another week just look at the data and think about the narrative and create some cool visualization. But you always, the data, the processing, the query always take more than what you expected. And exactly in the end, I don't have time to do that, or so burnt out, I just want to send an email, summarize some findings. But sometimes what I find helpful is, okay, I spend so much time on the data, and if I don't package this story, this report nicely, people wouldn't be able to get value from my analysis. And from the career growth perspective, people wouldn't be able to appreciate the work I've done if I just send an email. I've received so many emails that people, I'm sure they've done great work. They just copy paste the raw and polished table, not much insight, but just how, hey, I'm done with this. But then so what? I would really appreciate if you just tell me maybe 3 bullet points. What is your insights from this data? Maybe create a table that people can actually understand. And I know that's going to take a lot of extra work, but this last 1% is probably gonna add 90% more to this project than your previous work. So I understand we're all like burnout, but make sure you finish the project nicely, especially in the communication part.
Yeah, no, it's a really, really good point. I think that's definitely, like you said, like that last 1% of work, like that is also, I think, what gets people noticed as like leaders in the space, and like what gets people promoted, and like what conveys to people that, oh, this is a good communicator, this is a good storyteller. So
yeah, I just want to say one more thing. I think sometime before I send out an email, I will send an email to myself just to see whether the font, the layout would be look good. Because a lot of times, I think when you write emails and the table, the images, sometimes the layout is just not correct. Before you send it to like a VP or like an email list, send it to yourself to do the final double check.
yeah, for sure, for sure. No, that's really good advice. I feel like that was one, like consulting is really good at making sure that you like do not make mistakes in how you align anything, or like no spelling mistakes, like bullet everything. But no, you're definitely right. Again, it really does go a long way, and like it's good advice. It's advice that I still need to remind myself of sometimes as well. Like, don't just pull the data. Like, tell me what the data is for. And the thing is, I think what's difficult is if you have managers or leadership and they're like, get me this data, or like, I want to know what's going on in like North America, right? You want to do a really fast job for them, right? And like they don't, oftentimes people don't know how long it actually takes. People think it takes a lot less time than it does. And you're doing it and you're like, oh my God, I feel like I should have been done already. And then like once you finish, you're like, I just want to get it over to this person because they asked for this data. They didn't ask me for my opinion. But giving those insights, it really does separate, like, I think junior and senior. So no, it's really great advice.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that story. What you said is just feels so relatable, and always have the urge because you want to be quick. You want to say, hey, I'm done, or sometimes I feel anxious. Oh, maybe they're waiting. But, if they've been waiting for 3 hours, they can wait for 1 more hour. So I think later on I learned, okay, I don't have to give the update immediately, but just slow down a little bit, double check the data, because sometimes when you do it really quickly, it's wrong and it's awkward when you send it to them and they find out some mistakes. So, do it as quickly as you can, but have a second pass by yourself or by your coworker. I think I think people would rather to have something correct, even if it's slowed down. Maybe you delay for like 1 or 2 hours or even a day.
Yeah, no, you're completely right, completely right. Because it's funny because like when you send it and it's wrong, people like assuming that you don't really care much, but it's like oftentimes you really cared to like do it quickly for the person. Like you're trying to make a good impression. Like that stuff. I mean, that like happened to me last week where I like my manager was like, oh, this like one little, because this is the thing, people notice the one thing you got wrong, not the 99 things you got right. It's human nature. It is what it is, and it like looks like unprofessional, or that you don't care, even though you really do, and you just want to do a quick job. So no, the advice you're giving is really, really helpful. I'm gonna remember to retell myself that as well.
So I also find it sometimes difficult for me to catch the errors myself and to carry all the stress and burden. I think just have a little bit of a system. Maybe you can internally find a few coworkers to cross check your work. Just someone with a fresh eye might be helpful. Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah. So for yourself, you build a lot of dashboard and then do a lot of this type of quick analysis. How do you ensure the quality of analysis? How do you check your results?
Yeah, I mean, it like, unfortunately, I haven't had like systems in place where there's like other people that necessarily like could have like checked it. I think for me, for example, like, well, for dashboards, right? I think, and again, this could be awkward, but it's like, that's why it's good to to be in like a supportive team. Like, let's say you build a dashboard, before you send it out to all the stakeholders, you just send it to your team. And I remember that this happened at my, especially on the second role at Spotify, or even the first, but the second one, where people that are looking at it aren't looking at it from a data perspective. They're looking at it from an industry perspective. So they'll look at your dashboard and be like, oh, it's strange that there's like 0 listeners in this bucket. And you're like, oh, you're right. That is strange. I was so focused on the data and checking if my joins are correct that I didn't even think to look at the dashboard and be like, does anything here not make sense? And again, that's something that I feel like I don't do enough, but that I should. And that goes back even more to like what I was saying, where like I do wish that I had like spent more time understanding the industries a little bit better, even if I wasn't initially that interested in them, because you do get that, oh, like a sell-through rate of 40% in the US does not make sense. So like you can catch it in that way. So that's a really, I think, helpful thing for like dashboarding, especially, or really any like ad hoc analysis with visuals, is like if somebody who understands the industry better or who's familiar with the metrics like looks at it, because they might not catch your code mistakes, but they'll catch like the output mistakes, and then you can go back into the code.
What I was saying is I think you already probably done enough. I think for data scientists, we always feel like we're not doing enough. I think, it would be nice we can catch all those little mistakes or things we miss, but it would be impossible. I think it's a great way that you share with your team and just leverage other people's opinions. And then maybe you can have a note. For example, I always notice, oh, those are some things I kind of always miss. And then I would have a checklist for yourself. The next time you build something, you already know. It's kind of like a boosted tree. You know the area where you like make mistakes, and then you just kind of amplify that part and learn from the feedback you get from your team.
100%. Yeah, like definitely. And I've never been as like resourceful to like write down common lists of mistakes. That's like a really good idea. But I definitely like know off the top of my mind, oh, this is something that typically goes wrong in this type of situation. Like, let me double, triple check that part, or like slow down a little bit in that area for sure.
Thanks for sharing that. So what is the most high impact project you worked on while you're on the team?
Sure. And yeah, and I guess we kind of like went off topic. So I only really covered the first like 4 months of my 1.5 year stint there. I do think that the most impactful was probably the project that I just talked about, because that was like foundationally building out the data sets that power our KPIs, that also gave our team credibility, and that like we are a data-driven team. Because again, it was a new team, and like my manager, fantastic, like brilliant guy. But it was like still a new team, right? And I think having strong like data resourcing and showing that like we know what we're talking about and we understand, because licensing is actually a very complicated process, like mathematically, like music licensing and stuff, and content licensing in general. So showing that we had a really good foundational understanding of that and translating that into data, I think like gave our team credibility. And then externally publishing this microsite, working with like the senior leaders in PR and communications, like I mentioned, as well as legal and licensing, and like having that being reviewed by the CEO, and then going out externally and having a bunch of like reporters and people cover it. I think that was really high impact. It was like the first external thing that I really launched. After that was finished, like all of that kind of quieted around, I want to say like April of 2021. Then there was a lot more opportunity to do like different types of work. And again, this is where having a supportive manager is just so important. I think I was struggling a lot, and I'm still sort of struggling with this, and like really knowing what I want to do, what kind of impact I want to have. I had at that point been a little bit like, I don't want to dashboard and build data sets anymore. I want to do more like statistical, like causal analysis type of work. We hired another PhD economist on my team who is amazing. literally it was the best team ever. And so like, my manager was like, okay, why don't you work with him on like a causal inference project? That was really cool. To me, it's almost more like statistics and traditional data science. I know they're obviously very like correlated, but it's like, I think what people learn like in their econ PhD programs is like similar to like statistic PhD programs, and like they use different like languages. Even like I don't think they use Python like all too much. It's just different. It's different types of analysis. But I really enjoyed that because my teammate, like we would meet once a week, and we just like would go through this like book that he recommended about like causal inference, and just understand like the book. A lot of the examples they were using was like about education, which is really interesting to me. That's a field I'm very passionate about. And it was like, how does coming from certain backgrounds like impact your success like in the future? And just more of this like so almost like social science meets science work. So because I think I'm continuing to realize this, and almost every experience I have like reaffirms this, that I'm personally, at least at the moment, I'm less interested necessarily in like tools and coding, and more interested in the translational impact, especially from like a like sociological perspective. I had the opportunity to work on like some more like statistical type of projects, and then over the summer it's a little quiet at Spotify because Spotify is a Swedish company, and there's something unofficially called Swedish summers because it's like there's so few hours of sunlight most of the year. A lot of people take off, so it's a little quieter. And for example, a couple people during a Hack Week project, they developed an additional feature to Spotify that I thought was really cool. It was like almost like a TikTok. You like scroll through and you have like 10-second videos with like recommendations of songs, right? And I was like, oh my God, this is so cool. Like I really want to be part of this. And my manager was actually on vacation, but I kind of like volunteered because I had a little bit of extra time. I like reached out to the people and I was like, hey, like, first of all, like you need help with A/B testing. I want to get better at A/B testing. I'm really interested in this. Here's a way that this actually ties in, because it was in a different org, but I was like, this ties into the music mission, because if we help like discover more artists that are maybe not like your top 100 artists, it will help them with like their financials, and that's something that we really care about. So I kind of like wove in that proposal, and they were like, yeah, sure, like work with us on it. And my manager came back, and instead of being like upset or anything like that, which a lot of managers can get, like, wow, like great. It just really, again, just goes like show like how much your manager really impacts your career. And that's not to knock other managers, because the thing is, it really just depends on what your team is supposed to deliver, right? Like I was on a research economics team. That's a little bit different than being on like a finance team where you have like monthly, quarterly, weekly, like forecasting. You have to get it right, and like you're reporting out to the street, right? So that's something I would say for people to consider too, if you like more of like research, like looking around type of roles where like, you get to like pick your project versus like projects that are like immediately handed down to you versus projects that are more like long-term versus short-term. I really recommend understanding that a little bit better when you're interviewing for roles, and understanding yourself a little better about like what it is that you want. Your earlier question, like what my day-to-day looked like for that second role at Spotify, it was really varied by the timing. Like the first, 4 or 5 months were a lot more like foundational data sets, dashboarding, all that. And then once that was in a good place, it was a lot more of like, okay, try a causal inference project. Okay, try this like more product data science, A/B testing project. Then my angel manager, I told him, I actually think I'm really interested in user research. Because again, there's all of these titles that we just don't know exist. Like I never heard user researcher until I came to Spotify. And I was like, I think I'm really interested in user research. And I kind of sold it to him like, this is why I think it would be really good for me to work with user researchers. I think it would be really impactful for our team because, again, we are the economics team who cares about how artists are making money. Like this user research team is trying to understand artists and how they make money from a qualitative standpoint or like a survey standpoint, right? Versus just looking at internal data. Like I want to work with them and I want to marry our internal data that I built with the survey analysis that like they send out to actual artists and understand like where are things, where are there disparities, like what insights can we glean, like what dashboards can we build, what models can we run, right? So he allowed me that opportunity as well. And so that team was just, it was really wonderful to get the opportunity to have like a very varied day to day based on like what I was looking to learn or explore.
Thanks for sharing that.
That makes sense.
Definitely want to ask more about your experience in user research, because you also studied cognitive psychology in college, so you can also leverage some backgrounds there. So can you tell us more about what type of causal relationship or causal inference methodologies you used in your projects?
Yeah, so there were quite a couple different ones. So like we did like difference and difference regressions. We did like propensity score matching. That's a big one Spotify uses. Obviously like A/B testing like helps with causal relationships. But it's interesting because so like propensity score matching is really popular, I think, in the like data science, more machine learning community. Like our personalization mission really enjoys using it, but it's not as popular, I think, in like the econometrics space. So that was just kind of interesting, just seeing those differences. And for example, my teammate who was an econ PhD, he like developed his own causal inference methodology. Like it wasn't a given method. It was like something he developed himself and something that he would always tell me when I'd be like, well, how do you know to use this? He'd be like, I don't focus. And I think this is like might be a difference between people that immediately get into data versus someone who like, like learns like econometrics and economics. And like, he's like, I first think about the problem and what logically makes sense. And then I think about how I can approach it mathematically. So it's like a different way of thinking. It's really cool. It's a way of thinking that I like more, but as someone who felt very junior in their like skill set, I think it would frustrate me a lot because I would be like, what do you mean? Like you just developed this? Like that doesn't make any sense to me. Like, can you show me in Google or like on Stack Overflow, like where I can find this methodology, And it was just like, again, it was really interesting working with like my entire team, except one teammate who's also amazing. But the other three members of my team were all econ PhDs. So it was just like a totally different way of doing things. It's much less what package should I run? It's more like how do we develop a framework that makes sense and like use like pieces from different things. But propensity score matching was something that I was like really trying to understand and get better at.
What kind of problem you're trying to solve when you use propensity score matching?
So I was trying to understand. So we have like fan commerce offerings on Spotify for certain artists where like artists are able to show on their page like a couple of items of merch. So we wanted to use like propensity score matching and just like causal inference to better understand the users that are purchasing and how do we eventually target them, but also does having these offerings actually cause people to listen more on the platform? Like, are there benefits to Spotify? Because at the moment, the fan commerce benefits to artists and that's amazing, right? But there's a cost to Spotify for hosting, right? There's like Shopify fees and all of that. So it's like, are there long-term benefits to Spotify as well to like our music listening ecosystem by actually having these offerings on the platform? So that was a project I was working on with one of the PhDs, was to use like propensity score matching and use like various causal inference models. She within propensity score matching itself, like you can do propensity score matching in a lot of different ways and like set up a lot of different methodologies. Like she did like a random forest. She also did like regressions. Like we used built-in packages that people at Spotify created, kind of tweak them a little bit to like have a better understanding of the users. So like really the purpose of the propensity score matching, right, is like you're creating an A/B test in a sense, and you're sort of like separating, users into like users who, like, let's say purchased fan commerce and users who didn't purchase fan commerce, but like how do you like compare them to one another without the randomization of an A/B test? So propensity score matching is a way to do that. There's a lot of controversy apparently in like the data science community about whether it is actually randomized enough, but that was the project.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. I think that's kind of probably the focus of a lot of economists. They're working on the situations where a perfect double-blind randomization cannot happen. And with observational data, how do you create those propensity scores? So basically, they try to mimic a situation where the distribution of two groups are the same, or even if it's not the same, how do you assign weights to make them look the same? And then kind of create a comparison very similar to randomized experiments, and then compare the results. And like you mentioned, I think there some data scientists who doesn't believe in this type of structured analysis because a lot of assumptions goes into it. But I think that's the interesting part about data science. Not everything is always perfectly designed. With limited information, how are you going to form your assumption and draw insights from it?
Exactly. 100%. It's very interesting. And I do love that it like tries to mimic like experiments. I mean, it's often used for problems that are very interesting and problems where for one reason or another you can't do an A/B test. But it is like it to really, and this is true for all of data science. I'm the type of person where it's like I need to understand why or how are the weights being assigned, like what's going on, and then you like really get behind like the hood, and then there's a lot of math, and sometimes that can get a little bit overwhelming and difficult, and that's why I think like a lot of data scientists like they study like after work too, right, to keep up with that skill set. Because like I know I'm just thinking of this propensity score matching project, I could just write 1 or 2 lines of code and it matches it, and I might high level understand it, but there could still be that gap where it's like on the back end, I don't actually understand the math that like goes into it. And when you don't really understand the math, it's hard to be part of like those controversial discussions about why it is or isn't like a good tool.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
So I think I have worked on similar project like this before. I think the challenge for me was it's really hard to know whether the conclusion, the difference you see is real. So how do you know after you do this type of structured analysis using propensity score, how do you know your inference is true?
No, exactly. I mean, it's hard to know 100%, right? I think just like look like what I like to do is and this is just how I've always approached math, is like I like to look at a scalable subset of users. Like this is, and my coworker who was a PhD who I was like doing kind of like once a week classes with for an hour of every Friday. He would always say this. He'd be like, okay, before you think about the math, like he's like, let's in Excel do 10 people, and we're literally going to like look one by one what happens if you like assign this, and you look at it at a really small scale to see if it at least like makes sense. Like, okay, yeah, this user got assigned this propensity score, so did this user. Yeah, they do look good together, and there's also a bunch of like visualizations and plots that you can do to show like the distributions. Again, there's tons of packages out there that can show you like, okay, did it work? But I think that's still trusting, like, I guess like I like to check the subset of the data myself instead of just trusting, okay, this is like the error score, like this is what the distribution. That's just personally me. And I think maybe it's because I'm not yet as confident in my like mathematical capabilities. So I'm like, okay, like let me check these like 50 people and look, does it make sense?
No, I think this is a great way to check even in other data science projects, like machine learning projects. It's kind of like an error analysis, right? You want to randomly pick a few examples, whether it's correct or not correct, you want to understand more, because sometimes if you see a few examples have similar pattern and then you're not, which doesn't make sense, or you had wrong prediction, there's something wrong with your model. I read an article about like the power of small data. The small data will probably not good enough for you to draw a conclusion on the larger population, but it's good enough for you to quickly discover if there's something wrong in your analysis. So a lot of times we kind of just get buried in all the metrics, like you mentioned, the R square, the mean square error, or whatever. But those things don't really tell the full story. Maybe your data have this small subset that has something weird that doesn't really impact the overall score, but if your analysis impacting your users on the individual level, you want to make sure you cover that cohort, right? So doing those spot chatting, I think is very important. And something I also learned recently from a data scientist, actually is a neighbor living in my building. I'm going to have him on the podcast as well. He talked about a technique like before you put in analysis, you can label your data in certain groups. So later on, it's easier for you to maybe just sample one from each group doing the type of check you do.
Yeah. Exactly. No, that's really, really good. That's really good advice.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. So what were some other lessons or interesting things you learned from working with economists?
First of all, they were just like incredible people. Maybe it's like, oh, this person like got a PhD in economics. Like maybe they might be like snobby or something. But they were just like all very like just very kind and very intelligent and humble people. Like I really just like all from like wonderful schools and like great past experiences. I think like one thing that was really interesting is just like the way that economists approach problems versus like data scientists approach problems. Like I feel, and I don't want to overgeneralize, but it just seemed to me it was more like economists focus a little bit more on like what is the impact we want to have, like, or what do we want to see in the data, like try to understand it first from like a small subset and then branch that out into the data, as opposed to like starting with the data and then thinking about how to actually approach it. I feel like what's really cool about economists again is I feel like there was a lot of like developing kind of like statistical frameworks as opposed to just using packages, and really this like really deep understanding of like even something simple as like a regression, like what it means. And I think by virtue of getting a PhD, a lot of people, at least the people that I worked with, learn how to teach. So I felt like they were like really fantastic teachers. Like the way that my coworker would like explain like a difference regression, for example, was just like going at like, here's level if we look at two people, and then like putting that into the data, then extrapolating like these methodologies into like larger data sets. It was just like, it was so helpful. And I don't know, it's just like I really felt like there was just so much like patience and like just fantastic like teaching capabilities, like more than anything. But I really think to me like the key difference again was just like the way that they approached a lot of the projects. But I also think that there's a difference often between the types of again, I don't want to overgeneralize, but like the types of projects that maybe like product data scientists work on versus like economists. Because like research teams, research projects, like they are longer. They're more like, okay, this is going to be my focus for a month. So I'm going to iterate on this like, day by day, week by week, as opposed to I think a lot of times if you're more like on the product analytics or the business intelligence side, there's a million things you're constantly like, I need to know this, I need to know that, I need this dashboard, right? You don't have as much like time for like deep thinking and like, oh, this is an interesting way to approach this. Like, it's just a different pace, I think, as well. Different type of impact that the work has, different types of problems that you're solving.
Thanks for sharing that. And previously mentioned you later wanted to do more user research. So can you share what are some interesting things you learned from the survey, or what are some interesting analysis you did?
Yeah, so one of the projects I worked on was like survey analysis. And what was cool there, it was the surveys were sensitive topics. It was about like artist incomes and things like that. So I probably can't go into too much detail about the findings, but what was interesting was like what this is more like what I love and why I initially got into data science because I thought there it was like more what maybe quantitative user research actually is. Again, these titles are changing all the time, right? Like who knows what anything will mean in like 2 years. But it's like it's understanding the way people think, right? Because like data science is really cool because you see user behavior all of the time, but you're putting your own opinions and hypotheses onto these behaviors versus like in surveys, like people will tell you, I don't think I'm making enough money or I am making enough money. Versus if you're like building a model to predict how many artists are going to make enough money, if you're using internal data, you're using, researched benchmarks for what you think making a living is. But somebody could be reporting they're making $1 million and not think they're making a living, right? It's just like survey data is super interesting to me because it's like it just like feels really like personal and like human. And like I remember I grew up loving like quizzes. Like I remember I would like sit on like personality quizzes and like character are you, right? Like things like that. It's just like, and I feel like surveys are like quizzes, right? Like you're trying to get a profile of a person by understanding like their self-reported like self-analysis, and there's a lot of bias with self-reporting, right? Like a lot more maybe depending on interpretation than like hard like cold data. But it's just really interesting to see what people themselves think and how they think of things. So that was really cool, and that was more of like a quantitative research and like even building models again to like predict like what it means to make a living based off of the survey data and like marrying that with our internal data. Like that was interesting and complicated as well, and trying to really understand like even almost like checking our own data, like why do we see this but the artists are reporting that, right? Like that's kind of an interesting as well, just from like just purely like is it not going all the way there, like do people not know how, like you really get to understand from surveys how people themselves think about things rather than necessarily what is the truth, right? Because like people aren't always, I don't know, the truth is subjective anyway, right? But it's just like it's more, I guess, like people like might think that they like, oh, I get 8 hours of sleep a night. But like, if you track, like if they're wearing like a Apple Watch and you like track their like their watch are actually getting like significantly less, right? Or like what people think their like screen time is versus what it actually is, right? It's like, sure, maybe the truth is in the data, but it's also really interesting to see the differences between what the truth is and like what people think the truth is. But then what I also really enjoyed, it was one of the last projects I did before I left, was I got to do qualitative user research. And I'm super grateful for, so this is something I would advocate for as well. When I realized that I was interested in user research, I reached out to a couple user researchers within my like org that whose insights projects I'd seen before, and like I was like, wow, this is like really amazing work, really amazing storytelling. And I didn't ask them like, do you want to be my mentor? But I was like, can you talk to me for 30 minutes just to chat, and like I don't know, I love like talking to people. I mean, I'm sure you do too. Just like I love listening to people. I know right now I'm not listening, I'm talking, but I normally like to be on like your end. Like I love listening to people and understanding like their truth, because everyone just has such a different experience with any single job in the world. And so for me, like I had reached out and we kind of like developed sort of like a mentor, like mentee kind of relationship where like once a month, like or once every 2 weeks, like me and this woman would meet and kind of, unfortunately this only was like for 2-3 months, and then I left Spotify, but it was really helpful to just like share kind of what I was finding interesting and like ask for help in ways that I could like maybe pitch a user research project or something like that. But so I went off topic again. But the project that I got to do that I was really grateful to do was like I got to interview music managers about and got to do like a couple standard like user research things like doing a card sort or like a concept design mock-up. But I really enjoyed I just really enjoy interviewing people. Like I think it's really fun and it's really nice to make people feel comfortable and like it's like what in the matchmaking thing, right? That's what you do. Like you have to talk to people, both your clients and like potential matches. You have to make people feel really comfortable to like be vulnerable and even if it's something as simple as like, do you like this design, right? There's like a lot of different ways to ask it without like being a leading question or making someone feel uncomfortable. Like card sorts is like when you like you can use a Trello board, for example, and like people will say, okay, like you have 3 buckets. Here's like 15 metrics. I want you to like bucket these metrics in these 3 buckets, however you want, and label them whatever you want. Like people are really uncomfortable doing that because they're like, wait, what? I don't know. What's the right answer? I don't like people, right? So like you have to like make people feel comfortable and like, explain to them like there's no right or wrong answer. And like, like as they're doing it, like without leading them in any way, being like, yeah, wait, that's super interesting. Like, and in a very genuine way, but I know I really like loved that.
Yeah. So what are some other things? I really like a few examples you get. What are some other things during those type of interviews you can help the person in the interview to relax and feel comfortable? Because I feel like sometimes for data scientists, we also ask questions of, stakeholder or some domain experts. So to understand the data, understand the problem. So I think that would be useful if you could share some tips.
I honestly think it's just the way that you make people feel comfortable in any situation, right? Like, for example, when you're doing like user research interviews, like you ask people to share their screen. It's funny how oftentimes like that could be tricky, or people like share the wrong tab, or people are calling in from their phone or their iPad and like just being like, oh, no worries at all. Like, would it be possible for you to approach it from this way? Like, just really being patient with people and like empathetic, I think is so important. Not expecting people to have like the answers, because a lot of times, like when you do, like companies like pay participants for user research often, right? Especially if you're taking up an hour of their time. So I think people feel like, people feel a lot of pressure, like, oh, I'm being paid and brought on as this expert, and I might not have anything valuable to add. Or I often feel this way where it's like, oh, I'm going to say something, this is probably obvious and you heard it 100 times, right? Like, so people like apologize for things like that. So it's like catching that and being like, no, it's actually like, it's helpful if you say something the 100th time, because then it's true. It's also helpful if you say something that no one else has said before. Like, I think making people feel comfortable that regardless of their response, like it's still really helpful. It's still like a value add. I think, not asking, I mean, this is again, just like common, like just like how you ask people questions. Like, I think it's common to like being on a date with someone, right? Like don't ask yes or no questions, like ask questions in a way that really gets people excited and, oh, like, let me like draw on this experience or that experience. Like, I think that's why, I mean, for user research interviews, and I'm sure for podcast interviews and interviews in general, right? Like you have kind of questions prepared, but at the same time, so that you do have areas that you want to touch on, and you're prepared with that, and you're asking them in a way that's not accidentally yes or no, but at the same time, not overly sticking to the script and like naturally flowing, right? And like, okay, maybe I want to cover this, but this isn't as important, and this person's really excited about this element. So let's like keep diving into that. At the same time though, and this is something that I kind of struggle with a little bit, is like knowing when to cut someone off. If someone's like going on too much, right? Because you don't want to make someone feel like you're just going through a list of questions and you don't really care, but you also know that you need to get through those questions and you only have a certain amount of time allotted. So it's really a lot of these more like maybe soft skills or like EQ based skills where you're really just trying to make sure that the person feels comfortable and respected and heard, while still making sure that you get everything you want like answered.
Yeah, I think all those the points you mentioned can be very useful when sometimes as a data scientist we need to lead a meeting. You need to make sure people give you feedback, but you also don't want one person dominate the meeting. So I think the part you mentioned is very important. Sometimes I also struggle, like, how do I stick to my point when I have to lead a meeting with a schedule? So for example, how do you do that?
It's difficult, and I think prepping ahead of time is really important, and like making sure, like, let's say if you're leading a meeting and you have like a presentation or agenda, kind of having like a brief understanding of how long like each like each slide or each like bullet point will take for you, and then like baking in the time for like other conversations. I think oftentimes, like, once you get into especially meetings that are like frequent, right, you like at Snapchat right now, like we have a bi-weekly meeting where we have to get through like X amount of slides, but there's always like nuance. So like sometimes a meeting is 30 minutes, sometimes it's an hour. We put in an hour, right? So like little tactical things like that. But I think also this is something I struggle with a little bit, that like I've noticed like people doing that are like in senior leadership, they'll be, this is a really interesting discussion. Let's table that for now and get back to it later, right? So that's something that I want to get more comfortable in doing. I think when you feel more junior, you like don't know if you have the like authority to say something like that. And I think it's also like knowing that necessarily, I mean, this is such a simple, like silly little example, but like I last week at Snap, I was doing like a lunch and learn for on like how we do our forecasting practices to like one of our team, like our kind of adjacent teams. And like, I just noticed that we were running out of time. So it was like, there was a trade-off of like, okay, I don't necessarily, yes, I put a lot of time and effort into each slide. It's okay to like not show every single piece of work that you did if there's like a more interesting nuanced discussion going on. I think sometimes when people are presenting, and I know that's slightly different maybe than like leading a meeting, but I think when people are presenting, you often want to like, hey, look at all of this work, that great work that I did, right? Like I put time and effort into this. But I think it's okay if you don't get through everything just because you did it, in favor of maybe allowing interesting discussions to like spark and get people like engaged.
I think that's great, because you have to overcome your ego to showcasing all of your work. And also, you mentioned a great point, preparing for it is important. So before you go to present, maybe you also kind of practice a scenario. Okay, what if I prepare for this for 10 minutes? What if it got cut to 3 minutes? What are the 5 slides I have to show? And so then you're prepared. Okay, those are the things we can skip. And maybe you can say, after the meeting, I can send a follow-up email, summarize some things I didn't get to talk to. But I think it's a great point. Have some flexibility to allow some random discussion to happen. I think when I was early in my career, I kind of don't feel very comfortable about those discussions. I kind of just want to stick to the meeting schedule. I think it's also because I was a junior, so I would like struggle with the word you use, authority, maybe just because I didn't have the confidence. So that's why I feel like I have to show my confidence by, being firm on the timestamp, but actually wasn't very productive to use everybody's time in a meeting. So yeah.
For sure. I mean, building confidence is like it's a whole other like discussion as well. It's like it is really, really difficult. And yeah, sometimes also like you want to show your work because you're like, I'm not that confident that people know that I can do this. So I want you to know that I can do this. So it's really tricky thing to manage, because it's like in part ego, but it's also like just sometimes it's like almost like lack of ego, where you're like worried about how like your skills are being perceived. So, but I think, I don't know, I noticed it a little bit when I was on the interview panel for people, and they were doing like their final data science presentation. It's like very much like, and I understand it completely, like there is no judgment, but it's like people really wanting to like look at these 15 different models that I ran. And it's like and I saw that a lot more from people that were a little more junior, because they want to showcase that like, yes, just because I'm junior doesn't, I know all these models, but it's like, you understand this in reality, like it doesn't really matter how many like models you know. It's just like what's impactful and like do you understand like the problem space, and it's really hard to marry those two because like I don't know, as a data scientist, especially like more senior, like you have to be kind of a software engineer, kind of a mathematician, but also like a leader and like a speaker and like a marketer and a project manager and a product manager. Like it really is a lot. So it's tough. It's tough to like to do all of that because some people like their full like focus is on coding. Some people their full focus is on like presenting and like managing. But I think with data science, again, especially at the more senior levels, like you really have to master all of them, and it's difficult for sure.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. So later on, you moved on to Snap. Can you tell us what made you want to make the transition?
Sure. So there are a couple reasons why I transitioned. Firstly, so I loved my team, loved my manager, loved my coworkers, had a lot of like flexibility and autonomy. But I think there were a couple of things. I think number one, working remotely and just like coming out of this like pandemic, I think you just like get a little stir crazy, right? And you feel maybe, and especially during like early 2022, late 2021, like boom, like everyone's like getting a new job. Like I had a lot of friends like graduating law school and med school. Like I felt a little bit, am I stuck? Like, do I need to do something new, right? So it's like to like, and I'm gonna be perfectly candid on all of this. Like, is that a good reason necessarily to make a change? No, but that was like part of it. I think the second part of it was that I started feeling that I think one thing that really appealed to me about you and still appeals to me about user research is like the ability to talk to people and be like strategic and be less just like focused on data. What I mean by that is not focus on data from like an insights perspective, but like more on like, I think I was feeling a little burnt out from like writing SQL queries all the time or like trying to learn models and math. And the thing is that I think that when you're in person is more it's more exciting because like you can be like let's jump into a room and get on a whiteboard and like your manager, like your leader can draw it out for you. And like I just think about my boyfriend, he's a machine learning engineer at Meta, and like that's how he like in his first career, like he his first company that he worked on, like he would like go into a room with these like PhDs and they would like draw out like these really complicated math like problems for him. And I don't know, there's just more of this like camaraderie. But like when like for me, like I really am like I love conversations. I'm like a social person. And I think learning like math and code isolated in your room, it's just like already like it felt a little bit like I was like, I want to make a change into something that's a little bit more like strategic, a little more strategic, a little more like where I'm getting to talk to people as opposed to like only like focusing on data, which here's the thing, you can do that with data science 100%. I think I was just thinking, again, I needed some sort of change, right? So, and then the third reason, again, to be fully candid, was salary. So essentially, like when you transition internally, like you don't really have like bargaining power. So if you start in a role where your salary is less than the role that you then apply into, right? Like realistically, you're going to get the very bottom range of that role because that's just how it works. It works like that at essentially every company, right? And I think I was just feeling like it wasn't fair. And even though I had a lot of like support from my manager to correct that, like there's only a certain level of like correction that's possible. And I think from something that I was feeling was I know that like down the line, oh, why am I in tech then? Like I really, really want to help people. More specifically for me, what I'm really passionate about is like the foster care system and like children who are in the foster care system, right? Like I do quite a lot of volunteer work in that area. I also like donate like 10% of my salary every single month. And the way I was feeling was I could be doing more. I could be like get onto a board of one of these nonprofits because when you're on a board, you have to pledge like a significant amount of money, right? And I was like, I feel like I could do that if I was making
10% of your salary. That's a lot.
and this is like maybe cliche, like whatever, like I don't feel like I'm motivated by compensation. I just, for some reason, I think I got it from my dad. I just like don't really like things, but I'm motivated by the ability to like be able to use compensation to like help someone, right? Or like be generous
Yeah.
and like
Yeah.
get gifts for people, buy drinks for people, like donate, right? So I'm like, if right now my job doesn't directly impact people, which really
Hmm.
does take a toll on me too sometimes, like at least I can help people through this way, right? Through like donating or through being on the board or, having, and the thing is like this is true too, right? Like having, like you have this like incredible platform, right? And like even if your like day-to-day job isn't, not to say that you're
Yeah.
not helping people in your day-to-day job, but you know what I'm saying? Like you, like by virtue of having like decent compensation, by virtue of working at companies that people recognize, by virtue of having skills that people respect, you get to build network and you get to build resources and you get to build trust that people like would want you on their boards, right? Or people would want you to like run their nonprofit one day, or if you decide to like start a nonprofit, you have so many people that really respect you and believe in you and are like, she's really helped me with her content, like I would love to like like donate, for example. So for me, I kind of have that mindset where like, let's say, okay, I didn't go into like medicine, right? Like I'm in tech right now or is in consulting. Like, how can I leverage that to help people? So, but that's not to say that the element of feeling like you are being paid unfairly relative to your peers, regardless of what you do with that money, whether it's helping your family or buying yourself something really nice, it doesn't matter. It still hurts, right? And I think something I really learned is that like is, and I'm still really bad at it,
Yeah.
you need to advocate for yourself. I left Accenture for my first role at Spotify. Like I did not negotiate and I took a pay cut. And once you start at a company at a lower amount, it's
Yeah.
really hard to move. Even if you have people that are really advocating for you and are really like, hey, this is not fair. Like there's just
Yeah.
practices in place at every company. I know some people, and there's no judgment here, but some people, like if you go on apps like Blind, which I don't recommend people go on,
Yeah. I
but
love
like
it.
I don't know if you've ever been on that app, but like people I mean, people are constantly like, oh, like I could be making double here, I could be making double there. That is true. You can be making double everywhere that you move, right? So I think only chasing that, I mean, again, no judgment if that is what you're chasing, but I'm saying that for me personally, I wasn't necessarily chasing more. I was chasing a feeling of I'm being equitably compensated relative to like
Yeah.
my peers where I'm at, So that to me was like hurtful at that point. But I think that more because my manager was really willing to like help me bridge that gap. I just think at that point I had felt the unfairness for too long and I
Yeah.
should have spoken up earlier and I didn't. I think that mixed with feeling a little bit like stir crazy, I was like, I've been here for 3 years, like I need to make a move, I need to make a change. And I think the third, wanting to get more into like what seemed as like a pathway to management or like strategy or using data and insights rather than just developing like models and dashboards was what appealed to me about leaving.
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks for sharing that. I think a lot of times having a very supportive manager is definitely helpful. And a lot of times those big companies have those structures, some type of rules, and HR is very hard, even if your manager trying to help you. For example, a lot of our salary are related to stocks if you work for a public tech company. And for example, I have a friend, she's more senior than someone just hired on the team. But when she was hired, the stock was a lot higher, but the stock dropped. But due to those type of changes that they cannot control, the junior person ended up making a lot more than what she got paid. And there's really nothing her company can do about it. And then the only way for her to get to a salary where she thinks she deserves is to move on to a different company.
100%. And that's the thing, right? Like some of these things happen that are really out of anyone's control, right? For a lot of companies, it's right. Like people got hired at the bubble, and now there's a crash, and now they're like, compensation is worth like so much less, right? And I don't know. It's just like, I think, sure, again, it like you can always move and like get more. I think it's like there's just like so many things that you really have to like weigh. And do you feel like it's like just you? It's unfair to you, like you're in a unique position, or is like half of the company in the same position as you, right? So it's really weighing like like how things make you feel, like do certain things like weigh on your mental health.
I really appreciate you being transparent about your journey, because I feel like when we work in tech, a lot of times we don't really think about this negotiation, especially it's your first job. You're just so excited to get an offer. But for most companies, they usually have the buffer for you to negotiate a little bit. And I remember when I first got hired in Amazon, I think I didn't know what to say. I just say, hey, if you can meet me at this level, it will make me happier. And I'm also moving to a different city. It's all valid reason. And then the HR, I'm really grateful they try to help me. And then, they can reshuffle. I think negotiations, this word sometimes sounds intimidating to people, but you can think of a way just as a conversation for you to get to what you want. I think what helps is you mentioned go to some website like Blind or what is it, Levels, FYI, or just like talk to people that help you have that more confidence. Okay, what I'm wanting to get is not ridiculous. Other people are getting the same thing and is what I deserve. So I think have that preparation definitely helps with let's just say your conversations about salary. Yeah. And also I think in tech companies, unless you move to a different job family or become a manager, I think most companies, you don't really get a lot of raise year by year. And sometimes, promotion happens slow. So when you just join, your initial salary really, really matters. And that's actually the part when you have most bargain points because you're not in the company yet.
Exactly. And that's, like that's something I didn't realize, because I know this is like again, like things people have said many times, but like women and like people of color like tend to not negotiate as well. And I think for me, from my experience, right, like I have immigrant parents, both who like have never made much, and like they're really brilliant, amazing, kind people, but like they came to this country at like 30 years old not knowing the language, right? Like what do you expect? And like like I can't ask them like what they think is a reasonable salary, right? Because like I think when they started it was like $20,000 a year or something, right? So it's like you just like, versus let's say you're from a family that like where it's like everyone in your family is like VP at like a bank, like they're like, oh yeah, I'm making 600, like ask for 1 or 200, but like it's just like different, like people like, and I didn't feel comfortable. And so then like the thing with management consulting that is kind of nice, and I think it's probably true with like investment banking too, like these kinds of jobs that recruit right out of college or right out of MBA, the whole starting class has the same salary. And then like basically, at least in your first like 3 years management consulting, you get promoted every year. So you get like significant increases. And so I didn't realize really that it's not that way in a lot of tech companies. And it's not, it's a slow process, because in consulting it's often up or out, like you get promoted or you get out, but you can stay at the same level, and like I know at places like Amazon and like Google and stuff, and like Facebook or Meta, whatever, like they have like levelings, right? They have like L1, L2, L3, but a lot of companies like Spotify doesn't have that, right? So it's harder to like benchmark, because something like data scientist can be anywhere from like 2 years to like 8 years, right? So it's hard to benchmark. It really is. But like you said, like do your research. I didn't do any research. I was like, I like shot myself in the foot from the beginning. I was like, I don't want to do research. I don't care about money, like blah, blah, blah. I mean, I was only 3 years out of school at that point. Like I just didn't know. Like I just assumed it would be fair, but it's not. And then you talk with your coworkers and you find out how much someone of your same levels of experience like makes, and you get upset, right? And that's why companies don't like it when you talk about that. And I get that, right? But now there's a lot of more pushes for like transparency, things like that. And I think in that way that it helps, and it's funny because my boyfriend, him and all his friends know what each other makes. I don't know what any of my girlfriends make. Like we don't, as women, we don't really like talk about that as much. It's like more taboo, So yeah, like you said, like, yeah, doing like research and having a good understanding and not being afraid to ask for what you want. Cause I'm really bad at asking for what I want. So yeah, it's really important.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. So after you moved to Snap, can you share what you're working on right now?
Yeah, so I'm on the growth team, and like our focus is like growing daily active users.
Mm-hmm.
And so my team kind of works on forecasting daily active users, and it's a number that we report out to the street. So it's really important that it's accurate. Right now, we're trying to I'm trying to partner with a data scientist that is an expert in forecasting to improve our current forecasting process to make it a little more accurate, because it's interesting that there's like certain holidays like Eid or Ramadan that don't happen at the same time every single year. So like traditional forecasts like profit, for example, like they don't capture like the sustained lift from these holidays because they're at a different time each year. So trying to find a data scientist to work with to help like improve that process a little, to improve how we're forecasting for those holidays. Cause like now that Snapchat is like bigger in countries outside of like the US and outside of North America, it's really important for us to like more accurately forecast those users. Also, I like my team does a lot of like ad hoc stuff, like really like investigating like, oh, why was there a drop in daily active users? Why was there a drop in new users? So a lot of that as well. I think it's a pretty lean team where it seems like, and again, I've only been here for a few months, and it seems like there's opportunity for like different types of work, really depending on like the vision of the business. So I think like more to come on like what it'll look like. But for now, it's been a lot of forecasting and kind of more like ad hoc analysis.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. I remember in my first team, when we did some analysis, there are always questions like, oh, why there's a dip? And then you do some ad hoc analysis to do that. And sometimes it's kind of frustrating. You don't really always know the answer. So for
Yeah,
you,
for sure.
how do you handle those ad hoc analysis and all those kind of frustrations comes with it?
It can be like frustrating and it can be difficult, especially if you're not yet super familiar with like what typically causes it at the company, right? Because like in Spotify, after being there for a couple of years, I had like hypotheses right away. Versus here I'm still like learning, but kind of developing like a typical like analysis funnel.
Yeah.
Like, okay, like let's look at, I mean, it's almost funnily enough similar to like data science interview questions that like Meta asks, right? Like this drop happened, like what would you investigate, right? Like even though it's just an interview question, like it is kind of true, right? Like you look by like platform, you look by country or region, like by age demographic, like but it's obviously it ends up being a lot more nuanced than that. Like, oh look, was there a holiday that happened? That's kind of one thing that's interesting, that I've gotten to learn a lot about holidays in other countries and like how it impacts like people's like social media use during those holidays. Like that's actually been pretty interesting and pretty cool to learn about. And or like for example, because Snapchat, again, it's like a social media app, and it's like learning that are users more active on it in the summer, or are they more active in it during school, right? Like learning these different habitual behaviors. Similarly to like with music, right? Do people listen more on their commute than they listen on the weekends? Like just like in each company, kind of learning like the nuances of like how seasonality impacts certain metrics, but also like obviously like product launches and things like that. Like, oh, do we have like a lens that went viral or something like that? So it's really looking at all of these like different moving parts, which can be interesting, but also like very difficult to like remember what to keep in mind. And again, especially like we we're saying at the beginning, when you're spending so much time like writing queries, like pull this data out, it's hard to sometimes like stop and like take a second and think, what would be interesting to examine, because you're just overwhelmed with so much of what you're examining sometimes. So yeah, I think like a lot of the advice you gave, beforehand is like, yeah, taking that step back and like once you do it, take that second again to like glean the insights and like really like communicate them well.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. So from data and culture, how do you compare the data science work in Spotify and Snap?
Yeah, so it's pretty similar from a data perspective. I'm not a data scientist at Snapchat. I think data scientists at Snapchat, it seems from what I've heard about the interview process, it seems like and from what I've seen, it's a lot more of like PhDs, and it's very like very, very technical. Like I think because Snapchat is smaller in general. So I think like a lot of data scientists come with very, very strong like statistical backgrounds rather than product analytics. Although I think we have some product data scientists as well. It's a little hard to say or to generalize because like I've only worked with like a couple of data scientists right now, but all of the data scientists that I've worked with so far have been like PhDs and are like very, very strong mathematically. Not to say that they weren't at Spotify, but I was a data scientist at Spotify, but like I was more like a product data scientist. The data scientists that I've worked with at Snapchat so far have been a lot. They're not as much product data scientists as they are like come from a PhD background, like know R or really good at like statistical modeling.
Yeah, more like research scientists.
Yeah. Although I don't know if the work that they work on is necessarily research, but it's just like the background that they have is more akin to what I feel like research scientists are.
Yeah, that's it.
Like I feel like like I don't have a data scientist title, but the work that I do is similar to data science work, I think, as some of my friends at like Meta or Spotify.
Got it. Thanks for sharing that. And now comparing your journey as a management consultant and your journey in tech, how do you compare those two from like culture to kind of projects?
I mean, I loved like Accenture and management consulting. Like I know a lot of people have like very mixed reviews. I really loved it. Granted, I was like 22 out of school. Like every week we were staying in a hotel and going to client site and having like dinners, and like I had friends my own age on the projects. Like it's just like it's such a different life to like working remote and being a little older, and like it's just like it's almost like incomparable. Like I don't know what management consulting would be like right now in like this environment, for example, or like at this age or something that, or not at this age, sorry, at this stage in my life. But what I really loved about management consulting that I think a lot of people like and that can be somewhat tougher in industry is like, I loved the fact that you could be on a different project every X amount of time. Not always true. Some people, you stay on a project for like years, right? I was like on a different project every kind of like 3 to 5 months. What's really cool about that is I got to be across all these different industries, got to meet different people, got to work with different people. Like, even though the work that I was doing was quite similar across a lot of these industries, like I was building a lot of like financial models, business cases, opportunity sizing. It was just fun. Like, oh, new manager, new dynamic, like could be good, could be bad, right? Like you miss your old, like, it's just like, I feel like it's exciting and it's like dynamic. I think from like an expectation standpoint, with consulting, like usually like expectations are like very like you can't mess up like the slide format or like things like that, right? There's a lot of pressure there because like you're selling to like a client, right? And like you want to sell more work, you want the client to like you, want them to hire you again. So there's like a lot of pressure in that standpoint versus like internally, maybe there's a little bit less, or maybe internally it's based a lot more on like your specific team and your manager versus at even though your manager really like impacts the project, you can have I had this one example, like I had this fantastic manager at Accenture. He was a new manager. He was so good. He was really kind, really like empathetic, but our client was really, really demanding. So like, even though it was really nice to be in that supportive environment, it was still very like, we were all still on edge.
Yeah.
So it's like, you're a lot more just like dependent on the client. Right. But I will say that I think being at like in tech, again, if you want to learn data and like product is more helpful in my opinion, because you just have more access to things like because like when you're in a consulting firm, like everything is just like you sign NDAs with each client. So like I can't really send my other friend at Accenture like, oh, look at this cool dashboard I did. Like it's a lot harder versus in tech, like you can see everyone's, like there's like an internal GitHub, internal like Tableau server, like internal data sets. So I think like that, there's like, that is like interesting too. I think it's also obviously with consulting, like a part of it that can be stressful is like you have to like always be staffed on a project. I mean, you can be on the bench for a little bit, which is when you're not staffed, but like that doesn't look good. So that comes with an added stress, right? It's like,
Yeah.
where you're like worried, right? And like in that way you can like get pigeonholed more. So it's like there's, I think, more like professional kind of like rigidity in a sense than like there might be like in tech, but I still really really enjoyed it.
Yeah.
So I would recommend it for sure. I think like you learn quickly. For data, I don't necessarily know if I would recommend it, but I don't know. I had a lot of fun.
Yeah,
I really did.
Yeah. Thanks for sharing that. And previously, you mentioned a little bit. For example, make sure your presentation or emails look good always and bullet pointed. Your opinions or some takeaways. What are some other things you learned from management consulting that you think will be helpful for data scientists to be a better communicator?
I know that a lot of data scientists don't use Excel, but for example, like, and I'll kind of like branch it out, is that like when you build business cases and like financial models in Excel for a client, you have to document every single assumption. Like you'll have a tab of like your every assumption. Here's every source, every assumption. Like it has to be super clear. So like when you're presenting it to the CFO about like why you think you're going to save them $5 million every year for the next 5 years, like it's very clear to them. They have no time to dig through like your code. And it's something that I feel like that practice of like documentation and like code commenting, and even a lot of data analysts, scientists still do like use Excel. Like they'll pull in data from SQL, but like they'll like do opportunity sizing in Excel. And I've noticed that like outside of consulting, people aren't as consistent in like people will just like randomly hard code things. It makes it really difficult for like when you leave for someone else to pick it up, or for when someone's to review. So I think just like that level of like doing the project like you're going to give it to an external client, and in a way so that like when your coworkers are like looking at your code or looking at your dashboards, they understand things. So like if you have like terminology on your dashboard that you think other people might not understand, have a little like info icon, and then like in Tableau like have a definition for what each term is, right? Almost in a way like treating things that you send out internally as you're sending it to clients from like an explainability standpoint is like really important, especially for things like data science that is like difficult. And like the point that I made where like CFOs don't have time to go through models, it's like when you're presenting to a non-technical audiences, like they might not like care, like have the bandwidth to really go through like the nitty gritty. So like really just trying to like explain things in like a high level, and like diagram things in a high level, and like really make sure your slides are mostly, and I know these are like, everyone says this, but it's true, like have visuals on your slides and like 2 key bullet points, and like say when you're presenting, if someone is interested in going more into depth about how this is done, I'm happy to have a follow-up, right? So I think like really learning like that the way that you present things, the way that you like explain things is like really really important, and having presentations that look clean and images that like are centered the same on each slide, or like headings that are like start from the left, upper left on each slide numbers that are not like 2 2 3 like like incorrectly like labeled, like it goes a long way from like a professionalism standpoint. So yeah, it's really about just like looking like professional.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. And what are some struggles you have faced in your career?
Definitely lots of struggles. I think I'm trying to determine what I want from like a day-to-day, and then what I want from like an impact, and how like what I'm doing now can help with that. I think I'm maybe not as great with delayed gratification as some other people are. It's difficult, I think, sometimes to like not get frustrated with where you're at right now because you want to be somewhere else in the future, especially if you don't see like a direct line to it. And I always think about like my friends who are like in law school or med school, like there's a really direct. I mean, there's so many different fields of medicine and law, but like it's kind of more direct, right? Like you finish school and then like you do residency, you work at a firm, and then like when you're, if you like, let's say really care about like helping people, you could be like, okay, I'm gonna do pro bono, right? Like so you kind of got it, like you're good, right? I kind of explained that for me, like I really want to have an impact like in the nonprofit space, in like the childcare system space. I don't yet know how that's connected to what I'm doing right now. And that sometimes gets like, really frustrating. I think initially my mindset when I started consulting was like, I'm going to build skills, I'm going to build a network, I'm going to learn some things, and I'm going to like figure it out. Right. But it can get hard, and you can feel sometimes like your day to day has nothing to do with that like larger impact. So I think like dealing with like those emotions can be difficult. Sometimes I think also like trying for me personally to find that balance between like analytical and then like more strategic and communicative skills has been difficult, because I've realized more and more that I really do want to have more of like a like communication in my role. I want to like talk with people more, and it's tough because it's like, what does that mean, right? Like it's really hard in the corporate world, because you can say I'm really interested in strategy. What is that?
Yeah.
That doesn't mean anything, right? And like there's just so many buzzwords, and you're trying to like kind of like wade between that. So I think struggle I've had is like really just trying to find like my niche, like where I thrive, where it's like I don't think necessarily that like I would be the best data scientist. I think maybe I would be better in the role of, I don't like, if I'm like am in the AI ML space, like for example, or like in the data science space, maybe from like a product perspective, or like more of like a strategic perspective, like whatever that looks like, right? But the struggle comes with that is like when you have 6 years of being like the data person, like I was a data person at Accenture, even though I wasn't a data scientist, right? I was a data person on my like finance team. I was the data person on my economics team. Like you fall into this trap of like what we were saying before, like being a little bit wary of like voicing your insights, voicing your opinions. So then you just like keep kind of like re-pigeonholing yourself, right? So I think it's like, something I've talked with my manager about at Snapchat is I'm like, oh, I want more like strategic work, right? But at the same time, when I'm doing these ad hoc analysis, am I talking about what the strategy is from them? Not really, right? Because of what I was saying before, of like feeling maybe a little bit burnt out from like just being in data. So I think a little long-winded, but I think I'm trying to figure out my place in the space right now from like an interest and skills alignment, and then once I figure that out, trying to forecast my vision for the future about how I can use these to like help. Like I really like, I know it's so cliche, but like that's the only thing that motivates me. Like I'm very motivated by like, oh yeah, I helped this person. Like this is fun. This is exciting. Like, I really am motivated by that. And so like really trying to figure out, once I get a little bit more comfortable and like this is my kind of like space, this is like where I want to operate. Because again, this world of data science, analytics, user research, tech is really broad, right? So you can see like every 2 years I've sort of, even though I've done very similar work, I've sort of shifted titles a little bit. I'm trying to find like my niche in that space, and once I do, to kind of like bring it forward. And as something that you mentioned at the beginning, like I definitely struggle with like focus issues as well, and I think like the pandemic has definitely like exacerbated that. Working from home has really exacerbated that, because what I didn't realize was I actually got a lot of focus and dopamine from colleagues, and from like, oh, you need help with this, oh like, oh my god, let's go into this room, like let me figure it out, right? Like I didn't even realize, even though I thought I knew myself pretty well, just how much that helped my focus. And so that's definitely, something that I've like that I've struggled with, that I'm trying to work on.
Thanks for sharing that. And specifically about like focus, and you mentioned you have ADHD. How do you manage that?
Yeah, and that's something that I got diagnosed with after I graduated college. I like had a suspicion that I might have like, it's called like adult ADHD. Like I had a suspicion my whole life that I had it, but not from like I wasn't hyperactive, but it pronounces differently in women, right? And it's also tough because it's like mental health diagnoses are very difficult, right? Because they're not like a blood test. So like again, it's like self-reported and things like that. But I was suspecting it like once I graduated college and started working, I like got diagnosed. I was like taking medication for a few years, and It's something that I'm not super comfortable talking about it, but I will share. But it is something that's like tough for me to talk about. You know, I did take medication for a few years, and I think that also like I'm sure a lot of people can talk about like how ADHD medication makes you feel, but I think for me personally, it did make me a lot more like zoned in and focused. And also less, maybe I think another reason why I was less aware of how much like social interaction really helped my focus was because personally for me, when I was taking medication, like I almost didn't want to socialize. Like I was very zoned in and focused, right? And it's like it was easier for me to like sit for like 12 hours a day or something and like write queries and stuff like that, right? And in the last couple of years, I've decided to like taper off just personally, just because of the way it was like impacting my physical health. I think I started really realizing around that time, okay, like I like analytics and I like code, but I am more motivated by building relationships and like collaboration and like let's figure out like the best solution versus before where I was like super zoned in on like let me just like code up the best solution if that makes sense. So it's tough to manage. It's tough. I'm sure there's so many people that took medication for even longer and have like tried to go off of it for whatever reason. Not to say that it's bad. It's just personally for me the way it was affecting my physical health wasn't good, and it's tough. And like things like taking walks and like exercise is like really, and like getting 8 hours of sleep is like really, really important. It's not always possible to do that, you know? And I think knowing yourself, like knowing like when you work best, like I'm not a morning person. I'm much weirdly more focused like in the evening. So like I haven't put this into practice yet, but I want to. Like if you know that that's true for you, like do your like workouts and stuff in the morning, or like go on a walk and call someone in the morning, and then like then know that like maybe from like 2 to like 9 you're going to be like zoned in on work, right? So it's just like it's really like knowing yourself, I think, and like when is your best natural focus, and like playing to that and then enhancing that, and like knowing your limitations too, knowing that especially if you like taper off of a medication, or like if you struggle with anything that like if you aren't waking up at 7 a.m. every day, like it's probably going to be hard for you to say, that's it, tomorrow I'm going to wake up at 7 a.m., right? Like knowing yourself and knowing, okay, I'm not going to do that tomorrow. Like that doesn't seem likely right now. So how do I structure my day in a way that I can get done what I need to do without setting unrealistic expectations that just enable me to like fail, you know?
Yeah. I think it took me so many years to realize, for example, I'm just more productive also like in the afternoon. But in the morning, if I just wake up and do something, if I'm just blindly copying someone else's routine, that just doesn't work for me. But previously, I kind of blame it on myself. Oh, it's because I don't have this mental toughness or whatever I call it.
Exactly.
It's not my fault. I think we all have our own rhythm, and we need to listen to ourselves and not being like too harsh on ourselves, and find a way, like you mentioned, like works for us. That might not look like a celebrity or someone very successful posted on social media, and you just need to also have the trust, the confidence that, you know, whatever works for you is the best.
100%. And that is like really difficult. I mean, I definitely have a lot of self-loathing for like not being tough enough. Like not being meant to, like why, like my best friend is in med school and wakes up at 6 a.m. every day and goes to the hospital, and then she goes on a run and then she cooks dinner. Why can't I do that? Right? Like, and the thing is, like, just like what I've like noticed with age, but and also just like reading a lot is like that shame only amplifies like your negative behavior. So like there's no point. And it's like there's just no point. It's like I think you have to have that self-compassion first, and then you can like try and get better. But it starts with like knowing yourself and like your limitations, but still pushing yourself. Because it's hard, you toe the line, right? Because like sometimes like some people will be like, oh, sorry, I didn't like show up to work for a week. I was like maybe feeling like a little anxious, right? And like I struggle with anxiety too, right? So it's like what I try to like toe the line there is like, how do I give myself compassion without giving myself like too many excuses. And it's
Yeah.
hard. I don't know the right answer for that. And I'm really trying to find that balance.
Yeah. Yeah. Self-compassion versus self-indulgence.
Yes, yes, yeah. That was beautifully said. Yeah, yeah. And I appreciate you like relating on that because yeah, it's tough and I'm sure like a lot of your listeners, they probably really look up to you. So not probably, they definitely look up to you and like, for them to know that like you might struggle with that as well and that you might not wake up at 6 a.m. every morning and go on a run. Like that's like so helpful. Like, yeah, we need to like normalize like different like rhythms for sure.
Yeah, thank you. And I also like that you brought up this self-compassion. I think I read a quote that a lot of times the thing we criticize ourselves, but wouldn't say those things to our best friends, but we're very cruel to ourselves. So sometimes maybe think of yourself as your best friend, and how would you help yourself? So I feel like you have thought a lot about self-compassion and finding those balance. Are there any books or any resources you recommend?
There are truly so many. Let me look at my Audible list.
Mm-hmm.
And I will say that I haven't thought about self-compassion nearly as much as I've thought about other things. Like I think I have only started thinking about specifically self-compassion more recently, but it's very again like I come from like my parents are immigrants from the Soviet Union. Like they're like that's not a thing. Like mental health wasn't a thing, self-compassion wasn't a
Yeah.
thing. Like not liking your job and not being fulfilled was not a thing. Like
Mm-hmm.
when I tell it to my parents, like, what do you mean you're not fulfilled? You have a paycheck. Like,
Yeah.
what is fulfillment? Like, it's definitely like I think more recently I've been thinking about like the concept of like self-compassion, but I think this is not necessarily self-compassion book, but it's just like a book I want to recommend to everyone all
Yeah.
the time is like Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl. Like
Mm.
truly, I think the best book in the world. And for me, that book really helped me understand. It's almost in a weird way opposite of self-compassion because essentially his whole premise is that people in like 21st century are all super depressed, even though we have it better than previous centuries. That book, it's about his experience in the Holocaust and how he survived and how he saw why people survived. And it was people that like really like found meaning to like strive towards, like people that like had kind of this vivid image of like, I'm gonna find my wife when I get out of here, or I'm gonna write a book when I get out of here, right? The book was really powerful in understanding that like there are a lot of things that are really out of your control. What you can control is like your response to them. It's very much rooted in Stoic philosophy as well, which as a very sensitive person who's in touch with their emotions, like I didn't think Stoicism would resonate so much with me, but it really did, because it really teaches you that like things are out of your control. And so like you need to learn how to control your response to them. So I think to me, like Man's Search for Meaning is just like a really, really powerful book to put things into perspective and also to like understand why maybe, because I think a lot of people feel, especially like, let's say you have a great tech job, you live in a great city and like you're still like upset or like insecure, unfulfilled, like you might feel a lot of guilt, right? Especially with like globalization, you can see what's going on in the world and you're like, you feel guilty. Like, why do I feel this way, right? Like I feel like that book like helps put that into perspective and helps you understand, maybe find something where you feel like you're really getting like meaning out of it, out of doing that thing. One of the last parts of the book is like he talks about a butcher, and this guy's like the happiest guy ever because like he just has so much meaning from like him being a butcher is like being like everyone loves him. They go to this shop, they get amazing food, right? It's just like finding meaning and happiness like in like little activities, as opposed to like, again, with globalization, with like Facebook and social media and TikTok, like you can see what all these people are doing, and you're like, I don't have this impact, I don't have this reach, it doesn't matter. It's like finding meaning in that way. I do like reading Stoic writers. I like Epictetus a lot. I like the Handbook. I like Meditations by Marcus Aurelius. I feel like, I know, again, as like a pretty emotional person, like it's helpful for me. I actually really liked this book, which has like an embarrassing title. It's called The Untethered Soul.
Yeah, by Michael Singer.
Wow, you
What is
read
it?
it? Yeah,
I have the book. I think I read a little bit, but I haven't finished that.
Read it. I've audibled it 3 times.
Oh,
Like
wow.
that book, you know what? I'm going to re-audible it because that book, self-compassion and self-understanding and like changing yourself. This book is really good for that. It's really good at like also giving compassion to like other people and not like stressing that something is happening before it happens and like blowing things up in your mind before. Like it's a really good book. It's a really good book. I really recommend it.
Okay, yeah,
People
I
make
will
fun
definitely download it. Yeah, I think once a concept we talked about was like art of
yeah.
surrendering, and I think sometimes it's more like listening to your rhythm or what you observe. I think I kind of used the idea when I first started to write on LinkedIn. I was complaining about my blog on Medium. It didn't get a lot of traction, but then when people add me on LinkedIn, I just reject all the requests. I just feel like, oh, I don't know you, why there's so many people want to connect with me on LinkedIn. And then I thought about this idea of surrendering. Oh, people want to connect with me on LinkedIn, and why do I keep rejecting people? And that's actually I started writing more on LinkedIn. I kind of surrendered to this idea, this audience, and not have just a rigid mindset about this is what I want to do. Yeah, listening to the signal, kind of quote unquote, like the world tried to send you.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. No, 100%. And it's just like these books, like it's tough, right? Because like you read them and you feel that they're very like insightful and powerful, but then you forget, and
Mm-hmm.
like it's really hard to like put a lot of this stuff into practice. Like it's really
Yeah.
hard, but they are powerful in like introducing you to these concepts. And even like all of the books about habits, and
Mm-hmm.
like all of like Mark Manson's books. It's good sometimes to hear these frameworks and hear like, okay, it's not as much about self-control as it is about like putting systems into place that allow me to change my
Yeah.
habits, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
it's just like it's really hard. Like if I have cookies at home, like we'll eat them. So like I can beat myself up for not being a strong enough person, or I could just not have cookies in my house, like,
Yeah.
and again, like, my parents come from very like Soviet backgrounds that are very much like, you should just be strong enough. And it's
Mm.
like, yeah, I should be, but I'm not, whatever that means. So
Yeah.
I can either just like, or I can not have that in my house, right? I
Mm-hmm.
also feel like I mentioned, I studied cognitive psychology in college, and like I really, well, actually, like one of the courses like where I learned about Daniel Kahneman and like read like Thinking Fast and Slow, which is like
Yeah.
one of my favorite books and probably like everyone's favorite books. It's
Mm-hmm.
actually like I met my boyfriend at a data science conference 3 years ago because we both went, even though like we didn't like have to go, but like we both only went to it because Daniel Kahneman was speaking.
Oh.
And we were like, it was his first speech in like 10 years, but
Mm-hmm.
like just learning about like the two systems, right? And like
Yeah.
really, oh, you know what other book I really love? Upward Spiral. It's like
Mm-hmm.
more a little bit geared about like anxiety and depression, but it's almost like neuropop psych, but it's really good. It like really explains your systems and like how serotonin and like dopamine, norepinephrine like play into like how we feel. But the reason I brought up cognitive psychology was because like one of the courses I took is like where I learned about like the entity versus like incremental theorism, right? Like entity theorism being like you think that everything is fixed and that like I'm good at math or I'm bad at math, or like I'm
Yeah.
weak or I'm strong, versus
Right.
incremental theory, which is like, I can get better. And like I grew
Mm.
up in a very entity focused environment. Like, oh, you're good at math. Like you're good at this, which made me, or like, oh, you're good at guitar. Like, cause I like played guitar. It made me feel like I don't have to put an effort. And if I have to put an effort, that means I'm bad. And so what
Yeah.
all that does is like when things get harder, you like don't want to do them anymore. Or like when things are hard from the beginning, you're like, I'm just not going to be good at this. And that's not it's like such a like I feel unproductive way of thinking. I'm really trying to like break through those patterns. So learning about that I think is pretty interesting too in the context of self-compassion, because it's really easy to get down on ourselves and be like, this is just me, that's it, like versus like no, like things can change, but you have to take it slowly and work with yourself, not against yourself.
Yeah. That's really wise. I think we always have those labels, either by other people or by ourselves, on ourselves. But people change, or sometimes those labels really have to define, what we want to do in the future. Like you mentioned, right now you're working in data science, but maybe you're passionate about a nonprofit, and then you can transition your career and then you don't have to feel bad about it. Yeah. So thanks for sharing the books. I'm definitely gonna put those lists on the show notes and also download them. So what do you think about your future career? What are something you're excited about?
I'm still trying to figure out like the direction that I want to go. It's a little tough because it's like there's job titles and then there's impact, right? I'm less concerned with like titles, like to be a data science manager, sure, that would be amazing, like, or like a product manager, right? Or like even like a quantitative researcher. Like I just want to like do a lot of interesting things together. I think that's that like consulting mindset, a little bit, where it's like I want a role that has that is like informed by data, but where I am still like really communicating a lot, like cross functionally, and developing strategy and like helping execute on it. So
Mm-hmm.
I'm excited to at Snapchat like grow into that a little bit more and really like develop those like cross functional relationships. And then in the future, I mean, in the near future, like let's say like in the next 5 years, like I really would love to like manage more people. Like I've managed people, but I'd love to like manage a team. I would love to like coach people. I mean, I feel like managers both coach and learn from the people they're managing,
Mm-hmm.
but I'd love to like manage like, you know, more early career data scientists. So like that would be really cool. I'm interested in a couple different spaces. I'm looking and being getting more interested in like the biotech sphere.
Yeah.
So curious about like what's going on there. I'm really interested in like the dating app space as well. Clearly like as like being a matchmaker too. Like, so I love that space. I'm interested in like social impact within organizations, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I'm interested in ed tech. There's truly a lot of spaces that I'm really interested in. And I'm just like looking to grow my skill set on the more like strategic and like management side.
Mm-hmm.
I also like want to do like and am and like want to continue doing things like outside of work as well. And like I'm just a very open person. I feel like who's very much motivated by like good people and good mission. So that's like exciting and uncertain at the same time because like, you know, there could be a lot of like interesting avenues to like explore that in.
Yeah, that's very exciting. And thanks for sharing that. So, before we wrap up, for folks who want to continue to follow your journey or reach out to you, how can they find you?
Yeah, I mean, I don't have like a super big like social media presence or anything like that. I do go on LinkedIn. My friends always make fun of me because it's like my most used social media, but it's just because like I said, like I have all these like different interests, and I feel like you just see what other people like, and you're like, oh, cool, I never learned about this, right? So
Hmm.
like just like reach out or follow me on LinkedIn. I think I'm just like Felicia Rutberg. There. I have like Instagram, but like it's private and I don't use it much. And
Yeah.
then I don't have like Twitter or YouTube or anything. Pretty low key for now, but who knows? Maybe like I feel like there's a lot of ways to like leverage social media for good. You
Hmm.
know, the way that you're doing, and the way that a lot of other people are doing. So maybe I'll have a bigger presence somewhere. And I've heard like Twitter is like good for like intellectual discussions.
Yeah.
So
I also share the same passion with you in terms of coaching people early in their careers. So maybe we can have round two of this discussion or do some live events together.
yeah, that would be really fun.
Yeah. I really enjoyed our conversation and learned so much from you, and especially you being very authentic and vulnerable in telling your story. I really appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you, and you've done as well so much. Like I really enjoy reading like your material, and like I feel like last week you had a post about how not feeling initially like successful in certain aspects of your first job at Amazon. Like that's
Mhm.
really helpful for people to hear because it's really easy to just think you're the only one that's struggling
Yeah.
in a certain environment. So I really appreciate everything you do as well.
Thank you, Felicia.
Thank you.